For those people who are here for the first time this semester for the Now series, as I mentioned it at the last event that we had, this event is one of 3 this semester. And is this not too loud? Too loud? I think, no? And they're really all in some ways connected to the theme of art, in a way. We had Krzysztof Wodiczko, and today you, and then I think next week or very soon we have also David Edwards talking about taste and connection to the laboratoire in Paris.
Physical taste.
Physical taste, yes. But it's art and taste more. It's sort of the interface between art and taste. And Helen and I have been on this arts task force of the university together, really enjoyed being in her company. And I think you've all read a little bit of her bio that you know, you've been here now about 3 years roughly? 2 years and 9 months.
2 and 3 quarters.
Yes, okay.
Unfortunately, still counting days.
Yes. And I think it's fair to say that Helen's, you know, the university is really lucky to have Helen here, because I think she brings a real commitment and dedication and stature in terms of linking the university to contemporary art practices, and her role as the head of the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art, as well as the Houghton Curator of Contemporary Art at Harvard Art Museums, I think is going to be really, really critical. For me, I think it's a pity that her arrival has also coincided with the closure of the Harvard Art Museums for the renovation that Renzo Piano is doing. But I know that she has been super busy on lots and lots of other things, and this is partly what she will tell us about today. But I know that they're also, of course, preparing for the opening of the museum in due course. Helen has been involved in a number of major projects, and some of her publications connected to these exhibition projects are the work ethic exhibit that you did, I think, when you were still at Baltimore.
Correct.
And that, I think, also came out as a book that was a catalog that was published in conjunction with that exhibition. I think a lot of the work really focuses on unconventional ways of looking at contemporary art in terms of its relationship to conditions of production, reproduction, and really the dissemination of that work, its relationship to the museum. For us, I think also this work is really important, because I think in the field of design, we're also more broadly looking and spending more time. I hope at the GSD we'll be spending more time, and that we will have the chance to collaborate on the relationship between art and design, in a way. And also coming out of our meetings of the Arts Task Force, really in terms of what the GSD can do, because I know that one of the things that we were discussing and have been discussing is really the formation of an MFA program here at Harvard, but that might still take a little bit of time. And Helen and I haven't really discussed this, but we have more or less decided to assume that that will take a little bit of time. So we have, at the GSD, been working on the idea of a new MDes track. It's the Master of Design Studies. It's a 1.5-year program, which will broadly be under the umbrella of art, design, and the public domain. And the intention of that is really also to link up with Sciences Po, and that's where Helen has been very much involved, and talk to them. And I hope that we'll be working together. with Bruno Latour. And so we're actually hoping to start this new master's program in the fall of next year. So we will be announcing it in the next few weeks and then asking for applicants basically in a very short period of time. So we're keeping our fingers crossed to see what happens with that particular program. As you know from the advertised material, Helen, of course, is working on a number of different kinds of curatorial projects, and today she is going to address for about 30 minutes or so these three models of the retrospective, the historical reinvention, and the archive as the various models of curatorial practice. So please welcome Helen Molesworth.
Thank you. This weird paranoid thing that people behind me.
Put your knives away.
This feels loud. Is it too loud? Thank you, Mohsen. That was very nice. And forgive me in advance if I am breathless or scattered. In the last, basically since Labor Day, I've opened 3 exhibitions. I've never done that before, and I don't recommend it. It's not healthy. It may not even be interesting, which Donald Judd really put up as the main criteria for doing anything. You know, a work of art need only be interesting. I think the individual projects are interesting, but doing them all in 6 weeks is too weird. But the effect of that is that I'm going to talk to you about those 3 projects, because I really couldn't pony up much else other than that. I think that there are 3 ways that I think about my practice as a curator. And they are my institutional affiliation. So like basically what I do at the museum, which is a kind of housekeeping, curating in the true etymological sense of the word, to be the caretaker for a collection of objects that precedes me and that will be there after I am gone, and that has in many ways very little to do with me. I will make my mark on it, but when you acquire works of art for a general collection, it's kind of like pissing in the ocean, you know. It feels good, but you know, I mean, it's hard to measure. But I take that work very seriously. I mean, despite my flippancy about it, that's a part of my job that I take very seriously. But it's also a part of my job that I think of it in many ways as akin to housekeeping. It's the work that's never done, and it's the work that's, when it's done well, doesn't show, right? Then there's another aspect of my practice, which is the kinds of ideas I have, or the things that haunt me or trouble me, or the things I can't figure out for myself. And those ideas manifest themselves occasionally in large exhibitions that try to work through nominally an art historical problem. So in the case of an exhibition like Work Ethic, it was the problem of artistic labor as artistic labor was being reconceived in the wake of World War II and the rise of the MFA program and the rise of a service economy and the decline of an industrial producing economy, and how might one situate contemporary art practices within that kind of socio-historical framework. And so that's a big group show that I prefer not to think of as a theme show, because it's not like pictures of people at work, but rather was what I think is a phrase I've taken from William Peet's, a problem idea. You know, so the kind of problem of artistic labor and how it is constituted and how that labor is or is not legible and how it is or is not given value by the market and the various display organisms for art, the museum, the gallery, the magazine. But, and then another show I did that was like that was part object, part sculpture. I wrote a dissertation on Duchamp's readymades and have long been obsessed with Duchamp and got very obsessed with the erotic objects that he made in the 40s and 50s, and particularly Étantonnée, which he worked on in secret for 20 years of his life. And I made a show about that, like how could you think sculpture in particular after the war, after World War II, not this dominant narrative of sculpture, you know, sort of like David Smith, Richard Serra, Donald Judd, like one boy after another. But how you could rethink seriality and reproduction along models of the body and desire as opposed to industrial production. And those are these like big, juicy idea shows. They don't come around that often. I don't have big ideas like that often. And also those shows come about usually because I have a personal problem I'm working on. Work ethic emerged because I'd just gotten my first full-time museum job, and I couldn't believe it. I was just freaking out. I had to be somewhere every day at 9 and stay there till 5, and then there was an evening shift of cocktails and dinner at rich people's houses, and I was just bugging, you know. I just couldn't believe it. And so I was really like obsessed with labor and its legibility and what it was. You know, my mother kept saying to me, I know you're busy, I just don't understand what it is that you do. And I kept trying to explain what it is that I did. And then I'd go into a gallery and someone would say, my kid could do that. And I'd try to explain to that person what it was that the artist had done. And so there was work ethic all of a sudden. And I realized that that was happening, and I thought, oh, I need to remain aware of the force of my own narcissism, you know, the force of my own personal investments in my work. Not to let them fall into a kind of solipsism, but as a way to try and have a degree of intellectual awareness and control over the psychological motivations of my own practice. And part object, part sculpture was the same. The central object in the show was an object that Duchamp had given to his wife, Teeny. It was the wedding present. And I was in the process, as a lesbian, of thinking about getting married to my girlfriend, which was not something I had ever expected I would do. That was something straight people did. But I was aware at a certain point that part of that show, even though on the books or in paper in the catalog it looks like a Duchamp catalog, for me it's actually like an enormous reckoning with what it means to be serial, and what it means to be one among many, and what it means to have desire, and what it means to take the monad and make it into a dyad, you know. So those are two arms, you know, this sort of very workaday institutional life, and then other moments of great privilege and luxury when you have a great idea and you are able to get other people to buy into it and pay for it, and also when you have a sense of your own psychic investment in your intellectual work. I feel very, very privileged to have made those two shows. But then there's a third arm of curatorial life that actually takes up the vast majority of my time. That is projects that in many ways I feel I do for others, that I do that are less about an institution and less about me personally, my own intellectual work, my own intellectual project, and more about this imagination I have about a collective or a community or whatever kind of embarrassing word I might want to use to describe the people I imagine to constitute my audience or an audience. And within that, there is an array of different types of production. And I've done the 3 of them that I think that there are in the last 6 weeks. And one is a retrospective. So you identify an artist and you go to that person and you say very difficult things in many ways to that person. You say, you know, I think you are worthy of your entire body of work being shown from start until this moment. And I think I'm worthy of being trusted to do that. That's a crazy conversation to have with another human being. And it's something we ask of artists that we don't ask of many people, to lay bare their whole production in that way and to lay it open to a certain kind of scrutiny or critique. And so that, and this is where I pass stuff out because I didn't necessarily have time to pull together a thing. And so the retrospective was Luc Tuymans, who is a Belgian painter. And that's a very traditional catalog with catalog entries for all the paintings, good old-fashioned art history. We installed the show chronologically, beginning in 1978 and going all the way up to the present. And it took 6 years to make from start to finish. And it's up now at the Wexner Center, and it then travels to San Francisco, and then to Dallas, and then to Chicago, and then it ends in Brussels. And at every iteration, I will go and install a show with the artist, and we'll do a dog and pony show, and people will see the work, and hopefully this rather extraordinary body of work will be introduced to an American audience for the first time. And that's what I mean. Like, it's not, like Luc Tuymans is not my idea. Like I am a facilitator of someone else's project. And I try to represent his project in a way that is both true to him, true to his own sense of his work, but also in a way that partly takes his work away from him and begins this difficult process of extricating it from his intentionality, and begins to attempt to render it open to a different way of talking about it. Luc has been particularly strong in his intentionality. He very much believes that he has the smartest account of his work. Mm-hmm. And it was a difficult process to begin to open that up to a more polyphonic assessment. So the retrospective is a kind of practice, where I think art history is still organized around the proper name. And the retrospective is, of course, the fundamental pillar in a way of organizing a show around the proper name. In many ways, I feel I'm completely committed to Luc as an artist. And I think the show is great, and I think the catalog is great, but I suffer from enormous ambivalence about it as a project. It is perhaps the most profoundly unfeminist thing I have ever done. And there's some karmic price to pay for it down the line. I just don't know what it is. And I would say that in front of him, so I feel comfortable saying it here. I've dedicated my professional life to a kind of feminist practice, and I'm hard-pressed to figure out what is feminist about a Luc Tuymans retrospective. And if any of you smarty pants have an idea about that you'd like to share with me, I would be super happy to take it on. So the other kinds of things that I do that I feel are for others is the reinvention and the archive. And the reinvention is, I think, a relatively new-ish concept, and these are, you can keep those. I'd like the Tuymans catalog back because it's a gift from Mohsen at the end of this, so FYI, any of you who walk with it are stealing a gift, and stealing a gift is super bad karma. I think many of you know, because I'm sure you're aware of trends in contemporary art, that the problem of performance and ephemeral art from the late 50s moving forward, art that precisely did not want to be cared for in that traditional way by a curator in the museum, is very much at the forefront of what a lot of us are trying to do and think about now. MoMA in New York even has a committee now dedicated to trying to figure out how to collect performance art from the 60s and 70s. And there have been many, many recreations and reinventions, reiterations of past ephemeral performances. And in many ways I had been lucky. My recovery projects had involved these like ladies in their 70s who made, you know, feminist work in the 60s and 70s, and I was recovering objects, not so much performances, but I was asked last spring if I would like to be involved in the creation of Alan Caprow's seminal 1961 environment yard, which is this very iconic piece that you can see as the posters are getting passed around, which was a piece that Caprow did in 61 where he filled an Upper East Side townhouse gallery, the Martha Jackson Gallery, with tires. He filled the courtyard with tires. And he wrapped, the courtyard also had Brancusi sculptures in it, which he wrapped in tar paper and then filled with tires. Took these very beautiful photographs of this full field, and Caprow and girls in miniskirts hopping around the tires and children. And it was a very sort of, I think, Camelot era moment of where, you know, no more bourgeois culture, you know, you're going to wear a Pucci dress and touch the art, and participation is key. It's at the moment of the beginning of Fluxus and a certain kind of performance strategies in which the division between the audience and the stage was being broken down, and artists who were involved in that breakdown were trying to break down the boundaries between viewer and, or they were trying to shift an idea from a viewer who stands with his or her hands in his or her pockets and is engaged in an act of contemplation with a stationary object on the wall to one of participant. So someone who, with his or her body, moves in and around and amongst an environment and is not allowed to be passive. And this work, of course, has been taken up, notably in the 90s, under a rubric called relational aesthetics, which we can talk about if you want. I mean, it's a very highly charged term. And so in the wake of relational aesthetics and a kind of museum culture, actually, in the 90s, loving the idea of participatory work, because it very conveniently dovetailed with funding mandates around the participation of children in the museum. Again, something we can talk about. In the wake of the 90s, a lot of people started digging back toward the 60s and trying to find the roots of this relational aesthetics. And Caprow is very much seen to be the kind of an figure in this regard. So my first thought was, oh, well, sure, I'd love to reinstall Yard, be fabulous. And then I started reading about Yard and reading about Caprow a lot and realizing that Caprow actually used the word reinvention very pointedly. And I realized that I was actually not going to be able to reinvent the work in a Caprow sense, that I felt incredibly dutiful. That I felt I was going to try and basically reinvent the photograph in some kind of accurate way. And so I decided that if what Caprow's being dead meant was that his work was now available for a certain kind of interpretation, that what I would like to do is stage interpretation as such. And I invited 3 artists to reinvent yard pretty much simultaneously. And the artists were William Popel, Josiah McElhaney, and Sharon Hayes. And so these are Popel's drawings of the gallery as he's working through his reinvention. And I had long conversations with each artist just in terms of process. And at every moment when the artist asked me what they could do or wanted to do, I said that they could do anything. Not really, I mean, knowing that that was, that's retarded, you know? I mean, that's like a crazy thing to say to someone, that you can do anything. And so really, you know, what ended up happening was a variety of things, though, in response to that. So Popel filled there are 3 spaces, one in a museum space, one in a gallery space, and one outdoors. Popel had the gallery space, which he did, in fact, fill with tires. Although running along the right-hand side of the image on that platform are Army issue body bags that are filled with plaster mannequins, plaster molds of bodies that have then subsequently been covered with Vaseline. So if you grab them as you're climbing on the tires, it's gross. Like, it's squishy gross, really super gross. And the whole thing is gross because you walk in and the smell of tires is overwhelming, right? And then there's a light show, so it's red lights, blinking white lights. Sometimes it's all bright. Sometimes the light looks sepia, like an old 60s photograph. Sometimes the light is super, like, torture chamber kind of light. Sometimes it's more disco-y light. And there's a soundtrack of an Obama impersonator reading a kind of mashup of Alan Caprow, Popel, and Thomas Pynchon that Popel cut together. So that was the gallery piece. The outdoor site was a site called the Marble Cemetery in the East Village in New York, which is one of a handful of small privately owned cemeteries in the city. And in this cemetery, there are vaults underground, and all of the headstones are actually embedded into these brick walls, these old stone walls that line. So when you walk into it, it's a yard in the middle of Manhattan, which of course doesn't exist. And the artist is Sharon Hayes, who is an artist who has traditionally been interested in 2 things. One, the transmission of historical forms of protest in the present. So she's someone who's like reenacted like ERA demonstrations or the Memphis garbage workers strike alone, you know, as a small diminutive gamine white woman holding up the sign from the garbage workers strike that says, "I am a man," right? She'll do that alone in the street. And she's also been interested in this sort of category of public speech and its relationship to private property. So she filled this cemetery with yard signs, not using tires at all, the constitutive material medium of Caprow. And then the final project was by Josiah McElhaney, who normally is a glass blower and is very involved in the history of modernist design and the intersection between design and art, and usually like makes by hand laboriously glass objects that were designed to be mass produced. And what he did was we got him in a helicopter with a professional photographer, and he took, this is at the Queens Museum in New York, and it's on the back wall of the panorama. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Queen's Museum. It's one of the most amazing museums in the country. Its director actually has a mission to make it the most socially engaged museum in the country. So while we were installing this piece, there was a setup for the break of Ramadan, for the end of fast of Ramadan one day. I mean, it was just like unbelievable. Everybody in the museum speaks at least one other language. Like no one who works there speaks only English, because Queens, more languages are spoken in the borough of Queens than any other single place on the planet. It's a really amazing museum. And so what this is an aerial photograph of a part of New York called Willets Point, sometimes referred to as the Iron Triangle, which is actually the last plot of land in New York that's relatively unregulated by the city government. And it's filled with chop shops and tire dumps, and there's a whole black market economy there. There's no official running electricity or sewer system in Willets Point, and yet there's all this activity happening. I mean, it's almost like when you go to Rio, it's like a favela. It's really extraordinary. And Mayor Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, has this plan that by, I forget what the date is, by like 2020, he wants like 1 million more office jobs in New York, and his sights are set on Willets Point as a place which tall office buildings could be built, and jobs, you need 1 million more jobs, you need 1 million more cubicles, right? And so this is a projection that is 80 feet long by 23 feet high. It's enormous. Like makes Gursky look like, your iPhone. It's fucking awesome. And so anyway, in between like absolutely what can be imaged, I mean the level of image technology is such that one can produce such an image about that which is in some other profound way unimageable. But again, not a use of tires here, although certainly this image is filled with tires. So one of the things that I was really interested in this show was the radical proposition of the reinvention of history that Capra gives us. That we don't need to reinvent the past as it was, right? I mean, we can take Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history seriously and, insist on a materialist history that does not participate in a certain kind of nostalgia. But it is also then kind of scary, because like, where is Capro in this, right? Like, to really take reinvention seriously is to also run the risk of losing the very materiality of a historical situation. So here is, an experiment, a really radical experiment with what would it mean to reinvent a historical piece. And then the final piece that opened on Thursday, in which some of the people around this table were blissfully involved in, is here at Harvard at the Carpenter Center. And we can turn the lights back up now if you wouldn't mind. Thanks. Which is a project that I would say comes from the archive. And it's called Act Up New York, Activism, Art, and the AIDS Crisis from 1987 to 1993. And this is an exhibition that I co-curated with Claire Grace, who's in the room, who's a graduate student in the History of Art and Architecture program. And one of the key things that's in the show is the Act Up Oral History Project, which is an amazing document made in part by Sarah Schulman and Jim Hubbard, and Sarah Schulman is in the room too. What Sarah and Jim have done is systematically interview the surviving members of New York Act Up. There are 102 interviews with a waiting list of 108. So they're actually building an archive. They're building a living ethical archive of people talking about their experiences. They're building a living and ethical archive in which no one voice is valorized above and beyond any other. in which ACT UP is presented as a rank and file movement without a leader, that was still, that because of its rank and file, no leaderness, was able to affect an enormous degree of change in the legal and medical fabric of our culture when it comes to AIDS, HIV, and intervened dramatically in the most desperate years of the crisis in the States, which were in the late 80s, early 90s. This show is very, in some ways, archival. We went around, we asked people to tell us what happened, we wrote it down, we asked them to open their drawers and give us their old stuff. They did. We put it up on the wall in the most respectful way that we knew how, without killing work that was not designed for a museum, but was designed to be put on the street. And it's put out there in a relatively, as neutral as, you know, whatever, as neutral as a politicized dyke can put out ACT UP material. It's neutral, you know what I mean? It's completely neutral. I expect nothing to come of the show. But it's there, and that is a kind of practice that I think a lot of contemporary curators are involved in now, realizing two things. On the one hand, we live, as Derrida would say, in archive fever. There is no outside of the archive, right? Everything is. We live in like a fantasy of everything's archivability at the moment. I mean, you hear people like literally in their 30s talking about their archive. Everybody's got an archive. And on the other hand, despite the fetishism of the archive as a kind of modality, much is not known about ACT UP New York, which happened 20 years ago, right? So, there's something very intimately intertwined about, on the one hand, a fetishistic attachment to the archive and things imminent disappearance. So those are the three shows, and they occupy, I think, three different ways of thinking about how to proceed in what I would call the spatialization of material, which is, I think, what curators do, which is perhaps a link between what I do and what you do. I'm not, I don't write books only. I'm invested in making arguments in space, making them spatially. One thing I think that does bind the three things together, is, and this is just to circle back before I close to my own sense of trying to be aware of what one is doing, to be self-critical and self-aware of what one is doing, is that in each show the problem of history is front and center, how it can be represented, how it persists, how meaning is embedded in objects and things, and how those objects and things move through the world, accruing and losing meaning simultaneously. And that part of the job is to try and figure out what accrual and what disappearance you're trying to mark at any given time. And I think in all three instances, whether it's Luc Tuymans' paintings of gas chambers or William Popel's dark imagination of Obama as Kennedy, as Camelot and Afghanistan, and the inevitability that seems to be on the table about Afghanistan, that dark imagination, or the incredible violence done, born on the backs of faggots and drug users in the 80s, the incredible violence done to groups of people like that by our government. And its reprehensible and immoral neglect of those people who were sick. I do find myself, I think, in these three shows trying to figure out how one moves in the current conditions, in these what I think many of us now feel the tight spot offered to us in neoliberalism. But I think I'll, here's another part of the Capro thing. I think I'll stop and just for questions, right? And a conversation.
Sure.
And I'll answer, I mean, you can ask me about anything. Well, about curating.
Within limits.
Within limits. About curating.
Can I just start with a couple of things before you do? So, if I understand it correctly, you said there is such a thing as, in a sense, your own personal projects.
Right.
And then there are these projects which you, in some sense, you kind of disown, but you also, towards the end, embrace just simply by the time you've worked through them, it's impossible, it seems, to disown them because they have become part of your labor in a way, and therefore it's impossible to disown them as such. And you've also made them your own through the specific way in which you work with others. So I think there's something interesting there in terms of the concept of one's own project and the notion of a more objective project, which nevertheless has a kind of rationality which is still owned by one, and it seems like it's a very specifically also a project of engagement. It's a project that's political. So I think the nuances between those different, because for the purpose of our conversation we have the three models, but actually there are kind of four models,
Right.
And it would be good, or at least there are two models, and then the second model has subsets. It would be good to hear you talk a little bit about that. I was curious about what you said about the Tuymans being the least kind of feminist project, and what you mean by that. I also asked that in the context of a school where I think, many years ago, we actually had courses on issues of feminism and design, and today, to be honest, we don't have things like that, and I don't even know what we would do if we had things like that. So I think it would be interesting to hear you talk more about this issue of the kind of feminism in relation to curatorial practice. And then I have other questions, but I will leave it at those two, and then I think other people should,
Well, the feminism, they're related questions for me. I mean, one of the ways I divide my work is, like, there have been these moments, work ethic and part object, part sculpture, where the shows went up and I was immediately struck by a kind of panic of self-exposure, that I was visible in a way that I had not prepared to be visible. Even so much like a kind of deep structure of myself was visible, which I think happens to a lot of people. I mean, Lee Krasner, the great abstract expressionist painter, once said in this beautiful quote, she said, all my paintings are autobiographical if anyone would just take the time to look at them. One is hard-pressed to find the autobiographical in Lee Krasner's work. And then there are other things I do where I don't feel that fear of exposure at all. And people come up to me and say, congratulations. And I'm like, oh no, not me. It's all about, it's nothing, I feel myself a kind of conduit. And in those moments, I feel feminist because I feel like I am enacting Virginia Woolf's Three Guineas. I am enacting a kind of refusal of the proper name, and I'm enacting a kind of refusal of pride and a refusal of a culture of commemoration or a culture of medal giving or a culture of the prize, cultures which in Three Guineas Woolf brilliantly articulates are the culture of war, you know, and the culture of capitalism. So even though I could stand up at the Luke Tuymans show and say, oh, not about me, all about Luke, the intensity of his proper name was such that I had a kind of internal cratering, which was really different than doing a Louise Lawler retrospective, because Louise's entire practice is about the refusal of letting her proper name attach to herself. And so that show was in many ways an unraveling of the very idea of what a retrospective was. Whereas Luke's show was really just a big ass paintings retrospective.
So do you have second thoughts about things like that? I mean, based on your argument about the importance of the kind of commitment, if you like, or the political beliefs that are engaged with the first part of the argument, then it would seem, I mean, one could argue that then maybe you shouldn't be doing retrospectives of other people, and especially if they're going to be chronological. So why do it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the show opened in mid-September, and you catch me at my moment of most doubt about it, which tends to happen to me after a show opens. I tend to crater pretty badly and not believe in that which I have just completed.
But we all go through that. By the way.
I think we all do go through that.
It's not unique.
Yeah, no, and I don't offer it as such. I mean, I'm not sure I will do another big painting retrospective anytime soon. And it's not to say that I don't think that Luke's works are great and that they are indeed well served by the exhibition. But I did find, and this is contradictory, I did find that we were not able to critique, there was no imminent critique in the very apparatus of the retrospective in this instance. And let me put it that way. I would be hard-pressed at this point to move forward with another retrospective and/or survey show that could not in some way worm a line of critique from the inside out. That as much as I enjoy seeing those kinds of shows, I don't know if I necessarily want to be involved in making them again.
Right. Yeah. And then can you still say a little bit more about this, what you perceive or the modes or methods of what you perceive to be a feminist discourse in relation to curatorial practice? I mean, I think that also, of course, has a lot of usefulness in terms of spatial practices, for us. So I'm asking also from a more selfish perspective, because when you mention that feminist criticism being also a criticism of the project of seriality, and that this is really the seriality that's engaged with the body. I think it would be great to kind of like, so what are the things that make that distinct? What are the things that you think it brings out that other modes of spatial practice don't? And especially because I've also heard you express a certain level of discomfort.
What it means to be a feminist curator, I mean, it's actually something I'm trying to work through now as we, at the Harvard Art Museum, are confronted with the opportunity to reinstall the permanent collection. So I'll try and offer it to you that way as very much as a thought problem, very much in process for me, so I don't have answers. I know how to write a feminist article. Like I know how to go and I know how to do recovery of feminist material. I know how to cite, you know, Judy Butler and Drusilla Cornell, and I know how to, you know, dismantle Habermas, and I got it. Like I feel very comfortable in that discursive mode, in that rhetorical mode. And in my own daily life, I feel relatively comfortable in my attempts to refuse the givens of life under patriarchy. Less so here at Harvard, one of the most staggeringly sexist places I've ever worked. But, you know, with one day at a time, we'll get there. It'll be fantastic. It'll be fabulous. Green is the new crimson. What does it mean to be a feminist curator? By which I mean, what does it mean to spatialize the history of art with feminism absolutely in mind? And so it seems to me that the first pass that we did doesn't work, which is now we have all these women artists that we know about that can no longer be left out of the story that we tell, whether it's Artemisa Gentileschi or Joan Snyder or Lee Lozano, you know, or whoever it is, right? Harriet Hosmer, you know, whoever it is. We've done the work. We can prove that there were women, and we can prove that the work is just as good. And it seems like what one should do now is just simply insert them in their right chronological place, and voila, we open 2014, ta-da. But you do that, and it just feels wrong, like really profoundly wrong. Because one of the things you realize is that what you're doing is you're reinserting women artists into galleries whose construction was predicated on their very absence. So it's not like you can just put the Hosmer in with the rest of the neoclassical sculpture and be like, you know, done. There's our girl. Because she wasn't included in the narrative when it was being done, and then she wasn't included in any of the subsequent narratives. So to just like put her there doesn't make any sense. So where do you put her? You know, like what do you do? Like, do you put them all in the same room? That doesn't feel quite right. It's got that kind of Judy Chicago dinner party problem. You know, do you put them in the rooms at the moment when they become legible, right? So, like, do you dump the Hosmer in the room now because, you know, I'm blanking on her name, the Patty Cronin, thank you, because Patty Cronin's just done this big archival project, you know, dedicating her life to Hosmer, made all these beautiful watercolor drawings and made a, you know, Carrara marble sculpture of her and her lover Deborah Cass as a funerary monument in the neoclassical tradition. Like, so do you put Hosmer in then? At the moment she becomes kind of available for a certain kind of dialogue. Like, what do you do? And does the impact of all of that kind of recovery work that feminism has done, are we now at a moment where it just profoundly destabilizes the spatialization of art history as a discipline in the museum? And I think you can see that in even something like the ELLE exhibition at the Centre Pompidou, in which, like, in the sort of miraculously French answer to the question is you just put all the women artists up at once, and that way you don't have to worry about how to handle it. You know, that's what you do. But that act in and of itself expresses a profound crisis about how we are going to narrativize what has happened to the discipline in the wake of feminism, and how that narrative can then exist in the museum. So that's the kind of question that you know, when I go to work and work on that troubles me personally.
Maybe people here will have some suggestions.
didn't hear your question. Do you have to have a permanent collection? You're such a better feminist than I am. That's such a good question. Always start with the most obvious presumption. Are men and women different? Does the world need to be organized according to gender? Do you have to have a permanent collection? No. If you're a Kunsthalle, you don't have to have a permanent collection. You don't have to worry about any of this at all. But if you are a general museum and you've got all that stuff, then you've got that stuff, and you've got to do something with it. You've got to show it somehow, because I don't think they'd let us get rid of it, and I don't really want to. I have my own conservative tendencies. I got married, and I love the collection. Yes.
Feel it's part of your workaday job to? Do you feel it's part of your workaday job to enhance the collection, to rectify, let's say, the imbalance of the male-female, and bring the artists who happen to be women into greater prominence?
Yes, I do.
So that will tilt your acquisition policy in a distinct way.
Will it tilt my acquisition policy in a distinct way? Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I'm committed to redressing absences in the collection. The absences in the Harvard Art Museum collection tend primarily to be around 3 categories: work made by African American artists, work made by women, and work that is conceptual, work that it does not exist in the traditions of painting and sculpture. And so those are the 3 things that I do on a regular basis to augment what is, to try and create a playing field. So those ideas and practices can be taught in the collection along with cubist painting, color field painting, all of that kind of stuff that we're very good at. What would I buy if the collection were great in all of those things? Is like a what if fantasy question. It would be different then. Yeah.
I have a question.
No, because they're recording you, so you should speak to the mic.
All right. I have a question that came up and started in the discussion after the opening of the ACT UP show about the idea of politicizing the institution.
Right.
And I had a discussion afterwards with a professor from the architecture department here who we were talking about whether or not it's possible for architecture to be political or be politicized, and so on. And he was saying that in fact we're part of making institutions, and so that's problematic as it is. And so I think that's actually also true of curatorial practice, and I'd like to know how you think about it in your work. You mentioned the 3 modes of your practice, maybe related to that.
Right. You mean how I understand your question to be, how do I bring my own sense of politics to the institution I work in to remake that institution in some way? Is that your question?
Well,
No,
I
but
guess that would be maybe part of the answer, right? But
Uh-huh.
is that a personal thing that you do, or is there a way that you see a kind of a way of practicing that would be inherently, can or cannot be, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I guess.
No, but aren't you
looking
also
for-
asking something about the fact that we are, whoever you talk to, there was some suggestion that we were part of the problem in the sense that we were institutionalizing, as institutions, we were institutionalizing
Exactly.
the project. And I'm not sure that I wouldn't agree with that reading, because I would say from the perspective of architecture, what I've argued, and I would argue in terms of our responsibility, is that the work that we do in the school is de facto political, and therefore there's no escaping the politics of our work. And so what we need to be aware of is, in fact, the nature of that politics as we make the work. But I don't know how it relates. that's the irony, it seems, that, on
Right.
the one hand, we're operating within an institution, but constantly we see our work as I'm sure you would, in terms of deinstitutionalizing the institution, because that's precisely the way in which you are discussing the concept of dismantling certain traditions, hierarchies, and institutionalized tendencies of the Harvard Art Museum by
Right.
wanting to dismantle that to some degree. But I don't know how it works in the school when we're trying to make work. It's something I think we're very, very aware of. Anyway, sorry, but yeah.
Question about that.
No, it's just yeah.
Well, I agree with Mohsen in that anything it's a kind of truism, I suppose, for all of us. I mean, anything one does is political. It carries political meaning and it has a political value. There is no outside, right? And one of the things I think we all try and do is figure out what that is and how to align ourselves, how to align our practice and our daily lives with our internal ethical sense. Now, it seems to me that that movement between what you do and your internal ethical sense is often very far away from one another, right? And that the struggle to get those two things to line up is a huge struggle, one that is exhausting and depressing and deeply difficult, and that can be occasionally, we all lay it down because it's just too much to bear, right? And so the question is, like, how often can you try to keep that movement, that rocking movement of your own participation in the world, to get it as in line with your sense of ethics as you can, And sometimes that's about letting the graduate student do the work so that they can do the work, give them the credit and let them do a thing, move out of their way. Sometimes it's acquiring certain works of art that challenge the very registrarial system within which works of art are categorized in the museum, taking a kind of deep perverse pleasure in watching the whole system unravel because they can't figure out how to fucking give it a TL number, and sometimes it means, saying things that get you into trouble. Sometimes it means not saying things so that you don't get into trouble. But it always means, I think, a commitment to, and this is where I think as like younger creative practitioners, what I would say is, like, when you enter an institution, I think one has to be as creative in one's daily administrative work as one is in one's own project. Like, one has to bring to bear some of that sense of ethical purpose to the memo, to the staff meeting where you think you're gonna, where it would be more fun to poke out your own eye. Really to try and remake our institutions in our name is a difficult enterprise. And to just try and bring some of that creative energy that you bring to your own work to those tasks. And that, to me, is feminist. That is to put an enormous amount of value on housekeeping.
Yes,
I have a question. So how would you?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Okay, I have a question. So how would you sort of extend your feminism methodology into a little more global context? All artists you talk about basically within the canons of still North American and European artists. Even Sharon Hayes, she's a great, emerging, artist and activist, but she's so well known in New York. And do you make any strategy to bring in people outside of the geographical territories. Do you have any comment on your strategy?
Yeah. I have two things I can say. One is very sexy, which is we've started a new initiative at the museum for Latin American art, and it's great. It's super hot, and I get to go to great places and buy artists you've never heard of. And those places are like Buenos Aires. My frequent flyer miles are off the hook. And the other is more conservative, which is
We think Buenos Aires is very conservative.
Buenos Aires is very conservative.
To be
I know.
honest, there have been
And-
so many studios in Buenos Aires here that I'm sure the students are looking for something outside of
I know,
Buenos
I
Aires.
know. That's what I love about the undergraduates now, like their junior year abroad. They're like, I'm going to Tanzania. I'm like, hey, I went to Paris.
Oh.
My more conservative thing is, I'll address it somewhat more generationally than geographically, which is I kind of clock in around the time people are like the age or stature, as well known as Sharon is in New York. She is still, almost no one on my collections committee, for instance, knows who Sharon Hayes is. And we bought in the near future, and they are mystified by why I would acquire such a thing for the museum. So there's relative degrees of well-knownness. But I do kind of clock in around Paul Chan and Sharon. And that's partly my own disposition. I'm not really good in a studio with really young people. I get really confused. I don't understand what my role is, and I don't like it. And I feel it's just not. I don't do it well, and so I don't do that much of it. When I acquire works of art for the museum, I very much have a sense that I am not spending my money. I am spending other people's money, and that I try to spend that money with a certain degree of responsibility around who, and this is tough, right? Like who I think is going to make it, and who it's going to be important, and who is going to be interesting, and who has legs. And that's another reason I don't go too young, because I can't tell. Some people can tell. I can't. When I do big group shows, then there's a lot more room for that kind of flexibility. And if you run a Kunsthalle program, then there's a lot more room for that kind of flexibility. But I feel like the words of my old graduate school advisor in my head, and when he said them to me, I remember being so angry. Hal Foster said, work on the canon, because that's where the value is. And, apparently my apple hasn't fallen that far from that tree. I try to work on the canon, because that's where the value is. I try to double down. Yeah. So that's it's conservative, but it's honest.
Maybe we have room for a couple more. I know Sang-Kwan and then Julian.
Thank you. I'm actually wondering if you could talk. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more on the issue of temporal distance between the curator and the material, or the artist. For instance, the Tuymans show, of course, is one thing, but if you essentially, in a sense, have to wait until the death of the artist, and so for the curator to get some more freedom to do what he or she wants to do, versus and the issue of how to make that subject then relevant to, especially working with contemporary art or near contemporary art.
Yeah. I don't like to wait till the death. That's part of why I do what I do, because pretty early on in the game, I realized the people I liked hanging out with the most were artists, and so I am lucky enough to have constructed a life for myself where that's what I get to do with a lot of my time. And of course, I was trained under the umbrella that cast a big shadow around the death of the author. Very early on, we were taught I was taught that the artist's voice was but one among many, and that if it was in the mix, it ran the risk of taking over. So sometimes you shouldn't even put it in the mix. Now, I can't do that because I have an ethical sense of that the people who make things absolutely have to be able to be in the mix about what their meaning is, address their meaning, and help to create their meaning. And so the game of interpretation is really key for me. It is where politics lies, actually. So I don't want them to be dead. Then the question is, how much traction can you get with an artist so that that interpretation could happen? I would say with Luke, it was really hard, and it was the hardest one of all. Everyone else was much more open to letting us do what we wanted to do. Luke was tough. Luke wants to control the meaning. Yeah. But I also think, like, one of the reasons I'm drawn to Capro is not because he's dead, but because he has this idea called reinvention. That the work must be reinvented. He's very clear. It cannot be recreated. It must be reinvented.
Julian? Or maybe. No, please, you can ask the question. Maybe when we could have also Julian's question, and then
Okay.
Helen could respond to both.
I was curious if you could tell us about your general approach, or maybe some specific examples of how you look at installing your exhibitions in physical spaces, whether you see yourself as fighting the space, as subverting the space, the work between the architecture and the art.
Sure. I was the chief curator for 5 years at the Wexner Center, which is Peter Eisenman's first public building. I'm assuming I'm in a room full of people who know what that building looks like. I learned a lot from Peter's building about how to install. And the first rule was, don't fight him. Don't fight the space. The space is the given. Duchamp, étant donné. There is always a given. The space is the given. The people who fight the space, I think, lose. The space wins. Space wins. You guys win.
Mm-hmm.
You're the winners. Bravo, brava. So I would plead that you be mindful of your winning capacity as you move in towards designing spaces for the display of art. But I think my sense that the space is a given also comes from the artists themselves who in the attempt to dismantle the white cube, what perversely, more white cubes got made that were more and more increasingly awful. So I would actually rather have a space as complicated as, like, the Korb, the Carpenter Center or Eisenman, than a white cube. Like, I would rather have an interlocutor. Even if I'm having a disagreement with that interlocutor, or that interlocutor is fucking up my sight line, one of the things it does is it makes you think, like, well, then maybe the sight line isn't that great. Like, maybe there's another way to tell the story. So, granted, I'm not eager to work in a building as aggressive as Peter's anytime soon. But, Renzo's building's going to be super polite.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's polite dinner parties, and then there's, like, dinner parties that are fun. And, sometimes you need sometimes you need an asshole at the table to make the dinner party interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can we have the last question from Buenos Aires? Yes.
Yeah, I just flew in.
Uh-huh, good.
But I think there are a number of things that come from this conversation that seem to be extremely interesting. But I'd like to see if we can look a little bit more at the question of the archive. As you mentioned, that history is at the center of much of what you're trying to achieve. And in a certain way, it seems to me that with the exhibition of Act Up, basically starts to begin to relate the notion of the historical archive to the space of the exhibition, or vice versa. But the question to me is, in which ways do you look at the politics of resistance, which may be at the heart of what you're trying to achieve, in relation to representations of historical trauma, like AIDS, or like the desaparecidos in Buenos Aires, or many other practices, you know, or many other historical events that have rendered problematic and interesting at the same time historical and artistic practices. So there's a question there that comes from many parts of the world,
Right.
you know, and how do you engage and how do you position the viewer as a witness to those historic events, in the sense that Agamben suggested, being the witness, not the one who usurps the position of the one who suffers, but the one who basically witnesses that suffering.
Right.
So there's a kind of a distance between, let's say, artistic practices that uses kind of representational approach to trauma, and as opposed, let's say, to artistic practices that think of the archive, think of themselves as archivists. Example, Boltanski,
Right.
Or Tristov at some level, you know, where the testimonies, which you were saying, the oral histories, become part of the work. So the question is, how do you see this issue of representation of historical trauma in relation to your practices now?
Right. That's a good question, and I think in many ways it goes to the heart of my crisis about the Tuymans exhibition, in which there are many paintings of historical trauma that hung on the wall quite elegantly. That when I saw them individually, particularly actually in people's homes, in domestic space, in Europe, in the old Europe in many ways, I found them devastating. But when I saw them on the walls of the museum, I didn't find them devastating. They actually sent a different kind of chill down my spine, of a kind of the mawing capacity that we have to aestheticize trauma, particularly grave acts of historical trauma, in Tuymans' case, the Holocaust. And I was really aware of how incredibly different installing that exhibition was, in which I found myself trying to figure out where the painting of the gas chamber looked the best. Was much different than installing the oral history project, in which I was trying to figure out, make sure that every time you sat down at a monitor, you could see several other people talking other than the person you were listening to. Right? Because at the first we had them all lined up, because I had this idea, this fantasy that you walk into a meeting and everybody's talking at you. But then when you sat down at the monitors, it was totally solipsistic. She is talking to me and I am listening, and it's about actually a fantasy of witnessing that was too empowering of the listening subject, right? That I wanted immediately to I knew it was wrong. I knew that what you had to do was create a situation in which you realized you might not actually be possible, it might not be possible to listen to everyone. That there was an ethical imperative that could not in fact be followed through, right? And in some Levinasian way, the impossibility of that encounter with the other had to be constitutive of one's experience of the testifying subject, right? And in some ways, it's the brilliance of Sarah and Jim's project that allowed me to do that, right? It's a belief in that the constitutive affect of trauma is in fact its unrepresentability, right? And that the traumatic encounter produces a kind of a bath of language, you know, to be compensatory about which it cannot in fact reproduce. Like we cannot summon the 120,000 people who died of AIDS between 1981 and 1992. 120,000 people, we cannot, right? And so there's all that talking as a way to, you know, mask that fundamental impossibility. So I think that's like an easy spatial thing that was able to happen that I actually think is kind of effective in the ACT UP show. But it's effective because it's already in the work. I mean, it's the moment in a way, my crisis about Luke's project, my crisis of faith about Luke's project, and this perhaps I would not say to him out loud, is the ease with which one can make that image and the ease with which that image can be then shown and look handsome. And like maybe that in and of itself is an interesting project, you know, to be caught up short by that. But I don't know. I don't know. And now, you know, I mean, there's like, I mean, you know, from the Buenos Aires situation, like what do you do now with like a kind of hip attachment and interest in like the artists from Tuymans, you know, like how do, like now that's like something people want to seek out. Like we need one. It's a big question. I appreciate you asking it. I don't have answers for it.
Helen, thank you very, very much. It was
Thank
really
you.
great. I hope it was informal.